Everyone. My name is Taryn Brown. I work in business development for a company called Career Scoops. And Career Scoops is a virtual career day on demand where we provide resources and assessments and recommendations for young adults who are facing uncertainty on their career path. It's a scary transition for everyone, and we're just really here to help. I am joined by Arman, who is a co-founder of Career Scoops. Hi, Arman.
Hello, everyone. My name is Arman, and I am one of the co-founders of Career Scoops, and I'm really happy to be here today and to be here with you guys.
Thank you so much for joining us. And our speaker tonight for this webinar is Scott Hill. Now, Scott has over 30 years of entertainment experience, business experience, and project management experience. He has worked with companies like Walt Disney World and has managed projects for many other companies, both large and small. Scott is currently developing a startup accelerator program in Orlando, Florida, to help businesses in the hospitality industry plan, grow, and scale. Scott, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Oh, it's my pleasure. And I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you, Taryn, and Arman, and anyone who's watching. I've got an interesting experience in my own career path, and so I'm excited to kind of share that a little bit and let your um, participants in the webinar and people that are interested in learning more about career scoops understand a little bit more about what kind of possibilities there are out there, because I've had that opportunity to explore quite a few of them, and I've really had a fun journey doing it.
Absolutely. We're really excited to hear your thoughts and your experience. And we are, at this webinar, our goal is to give the viewers tangible goals on how to discover the possibilities of their career path, how to navigate uncertainty, how to maximize their experience. So without further ado, Scott, you have the floor.
All right, great. Well, thank you. Well, the company that I'm working I've been working with for a number of years is called Technology. I am a business consultant and technology consultant and advisor for a number of different types of companies. I work with small startups on coming up with ideas on how they're putting together their business plans, and then I work with individuals on working with technology in getting their if they're doing video work or things like that. So I kind of use my background, which I'll talk about here in a little bit, of as I draw from that to help other people and their companies. I am 56 years old. I live in Orlando, Florida, and I have since I was about 20. Again, I'm a startup consultant and a technical advisor. I got remarried a little over 3 years ago, and between my wife and I, we have 6 children. So they range in age from 13 to 27. The 27-year-old, just to give you an idea of career possibilities and how my experience really spans a lot of this. Our 26-year-old is a CPA, and she's married. Her husband works for Hershey's, the chocolate company. So they're both well into their careers and doing really well. Our next one down, she's 24, and she started going to college to be an emergency medical technician. Ended up changing to animal sciences and is now working with Petco Corporation. With working with small animals. My son from is 24, and he just got married. He works for Disney, but he's starting a photography business. So he's working on his own entrepreneurial and freelancing kind of work. we've got a 22-year-old who is a theater major at Florida State. And then we have a 19-year-old who hasn't got the slightest idea what he wants to do yet. He graduated from high school a little bit over a year ago, took some classes this past year at college, but is still trying to figure out exactly what he wants to do. He's working at a golf course right now and loves it. So he may end up pursuing something with that. And then I've got a 13-year-old. She's the anomaly. She's a dancer, but she has already decided that she wants to be a pediatric neurosurgeon. So I don't know exactly what to do with that, but we're trying to figure out on if we need to figure out how to get her to a school like Cornell or something like that. So again, completely running the gamut of ideas and possibilities right there in my own family. And my wife, she ran a daycare for a little over a decade, and then had her own sales business for a number of years until the pandemic. And since the pandemic, she now works from home for an insurance company. So we have a home office set up for her and a separate home office for me because I work out of my home. Um, so like I say again, that's just my family. If we want to talk about my experience, I went to high school back in the 80s, and during the first part of high school, I knew I wanted to be an architect. Um, didn't really pursue that. I thought about going into the military. I was actually very close into joining the Air Force. Ended up not doing that. I was a musician, and I really enjoyed my music. I enjoyed working with a couple of the bands that I was in. I became a sound engineer, an audio engineer. And when when it was time for me to go to college, I ended up going to university for 1 year, and then I moved down here to Florida. I went to university in Nebraska. I moved down here to Florida, and if anybody's ever heard of Full Sail, it's a pretty large school down here that specializes right now in gaming technology and film technology. When I went, it was just audio engineering, but it was a very, very detailed program, even way back then. And I learned a lot from going through that program in how to solve problems, how to look at things in kind of at that time in a linear fashion. So this happens, then this happens, then this happens. And that goes into audio engineering. If you think there's a microphone at one end and a speaker at the other, and there's stuff in between. And I had to work on dealing with the stuff in between. So that was my first kind of foray into something like project management, where if something was going wrong, you had to find where along that line it was going. When I got out of Full Sail, I worked for a couple different places around Orlando, and then pretty soon ended up working at Walt Disney World. Again, I started as an audio engineer, but I was in the right place at the right time, and I got asked if I wanted to learn how to work on the laser show at Epcot, which back then was called Illuminations. Well, if you've been in a job for 5 weeks and somebody suddenly asks you if you want to play with lasers and fireworks, the kind of obvious answer is, well, yes. So I got to do that. I got to work with the laser and fireworks department for about 10 years, and I was able to learn a lot of things. And one thing that I want to stress is that whatever situation you're in, if there's an opportunity for you to learn something while you're doing it that can expand your own personal horizon, do whatever you can to take that opportunity. I was in a place where we had a lot of computers that were sitting around, and one of them had AutoCAD on it. So when I was, at work and I had some time, I would sit down at that computer and I started playing around with AutoCAD. And AutoCAD is an engineering and design software that, you design buildings and equipment and things with. So I got to play with that because I spent the time to learn that. While I was working with the fireworks division, I got asked to work with the special events division. I got to end up working on designing some very large events. Some of you may have heard about the FIRST robotics, FIRST robotics. It's a competition where high school students build robots, and they take them and they play games with them against each other. And we hosted the national and international competitions for that. Because of my experience and because of things that I had worked on, I got to design uh, the um, the arena that we put on these international competitions in. And at its largest, it was a 14,000 seat arena, so about the size of the Amway um, arena where the Orlando Magic play. So something like that. I got to be the primary designer for that event. Just an incredible opportunity. And I got to work on a number of the parades and a number of the shows that were happening at Disney during my career there. And a lot of that was because I took the opportunity to learn some things that weren't necessarily exactly what I was doing for my job, but I was able to kind of parlay them into new possibilities and new opportunities for me. And when I ended up leaving Disney, I went to work for actually a interesting company that flies kites professionally. Um, so again, just really creative people that I got to work with. But there was a time where what I call the big transition. I went from working for a large company, Walt Disney World, to working for a series of small companies, small production companies. I worked for an ice cream manufacturer for one time as their director of marketing. Um, because again, when I was in design at Disney, I got to learn a lot of things like if you know of Adobe Illustrator and Photoshop. I got to work with those kinds of pieces of software, so I was able to learn those and parlay that into some marketing experience. So I got to work with, like I say, a number of small companies after working with a large company for a while. Um, because I had only gone to 1 year of university and I didn't get a degree from Full Sail in 2015, I decided to go back to school, and I went online and spent a few years and got my bachelor's degree. I got my bachelor's degree in business project management because I kind of looked back at, okay, what is it that I've been doing? I've been working on a lot of projects, and I've been working on them uh, in conjunction with other people, in conjunction with other organizations, and finding my part in that. I realized was a lot of what project management is. So I got my degree in project management, and through that, I was able to understand that after all of my experience, all of the things that I was given for opportunities and things to learn, it more became about what I know than what I do. That drove me into some of the other things that I got involved in. And so that was kind of an exciting revelation. If you can concentrate on what it is that what you know, what you've learned, and how you can use that in various different situations, then you're going to be a lot more valuable to an employer, or you're going to have a lot more opportunities that you're going to be able to take advantage of, because you're not just concentrating on the thing that you're doing and tasks or following directions. It's important to do those things, but if you can take your knowledge and your experience and say, I can apply that here or here or here, then all of a sudden you're creating all sorts of new possibilities, and people are going to see you as a more interesting employee, or someone that they can do business with or do projects with or create with. So whatever it is that you're looking to do, by looking at what you know and what you've learned versus what you do, um, it, it's really a different way to look at it. It's a different mindset. And there's a thing called a growth mindset versus a fixed mindset. And that's kind of what I equate this to. If I'm thinking about what I do, then that's more of a fixed mindset. It's like, well, I'm kind of in this box. But if I'm thinking about, okay, this is what I know, or this is what I've learned, or this is what I've been able to apply in various different situations. So maybe I can take this piece over here and put it over there. Well, now all of a sudden I have a more growth, a more open, a more infinite mindset. And I'm able to, look at things from a different perspective and see new opportunities and see new possibilities. So there, we hit where I'm at right now. And kind of in 2018, I decided that it was sort of important for me to decide what I want to be when I grow up. That's what that silly little word is there. That's, so in my 50s, I'm now figuring out what I want to be when I grow up. And what I want to be is I want to be a consultant to helping other people find their path along their journey, whether it's individuals. I've been mentoring some people on helping them, some young people on their careers and their choices and what they're learning. And then I'm working with, as I said, a number of different businesses on the kinds of things that they do. So there's something that I wanted to discuss a little bit, just the different kinds of possibilities that are out there that a young person can look at. And there's 20 lines on this list. This is by no means a finite list. This is just, as you're looking at different possibilities and different career paths that you might be interested in, really expand and say, okay, if I'm interested in esports, okay, that's a huge field, and there's a lot of competition to it. So, okay, what could I learn, or what could I take from maybe another passion that I have? Maybe I'm good at drawing, or maybe I've got I'm good at talking to people. Well, take some of those other attributes that you have and see what you can throw into that. And maybe it isn't just gaming, but maybe it's the marketing for gaming, or maybe it's instead of necessarily coming up with new games, you're coming up with ways that others can play those games better. So and if you're interested in culinary, if you want to be a chef, then maybe look at, okay, if I want to be a chef, then what's you know what do I like to do on a weekend that isn't necessarily a chef, and how can I marry this thing over here that I'm doing with this thing over here that I enjoy or that I've learned. And again, it's kind of taking those things from what you do to what you know. So I just wanted to kind of throw this up here as uh, um, a really small list of the different kinds of things that young people can look into as far as possibilities. Um, I wanted to throw up a little bit of statistics, and I put up there for nerds because I am a bit of a nerd myself. Um, when you hear about the unemployment rate, or when you hear about what if you listen to the news, or if you pass a YouTube channel that happens to talk about some of these things that are going on, what do some of these things mean? And I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on this, but I do want to have some of our young viewers understand that when these things are being talked about, whether it's by the government or by the news or by your parents or by some friends or by a teacher, that uh, they do affect you. So just kind of keeping a little bit of a tab on what's going on in the world actually will help you in making some decisions. Because if you want to look up, okay, this, I'm interested in this particular field. Well, if you go to someplace like the US Bureau of Labor Statistics, you can actually dive down into some of the information that they have and find out, uh, you know, maybe some specifics on that particular industry or that particular career field. And there's a lot of different resources that you can get into that that can find that kind of information. But I just wanted to put this up here because this is the latest compiling that this government organization has on where the labor force is right now. And you see that bottom one, youth unemployment, 8.7%. What if you turn that around? That means that youth that are being counted, that are out there working and participating in the job market. Well, you know what? More than 90% of them actually have been successful in getting jobs. Now, it may be a part-time job. It may not be what they're wanting to do ultimately in their life, but there's actually for youth employment, that's actually a pretty good statistic right now. So now is a good time to get involved in what it is that you're wanting to do, whatever your career is. Now's a good time to explore it. Really, no matter what it is. So again, that's just kind of a little bit of some information that is out there. And when you're looking at what you want to do as a career or as you know the next thing that you're working on, there are lots of resources out there, and I really suggest getting involved with and knowing maybe somebody that works at your local library, because even though that we can find information on the internet about anything at all, if you go to a librarian at the public library and say, I want to know about this particular thing, chances are they're going to be able to push you into the right direction. I've got a really good friend at the Orlando Public Library. Her name is Jane Tracy. She's fantastic, and she helps young people all the time with this sort of thing. So I'm going to end with where what I'm working on right now. It's been mentioned that I'm working on a business accelerator program, and this is again to help startups grow. And really what I've been talking about with helping young people, this is what I do with businesses and helping them to come up with their pitch so they can pitch in front of investors, helping them to work on their business plans, helping them to do what we call customer discovery, make sure that the idea that they have, the business that they're wanting to grow, is actually something that people would want to buy. And that's one of the most important things with business. And there are people that'll say 95% of businesses fail, and usually the reason is because they're trying to sell something that nobody wants to buy. So my process is to help them work that out. So there's my story. There's some things about me, and I know that Taryn and Arman both have some questions for me. So I appreciate you guys giving me a little opportunity to talk some things through and give a little bit about my perspective, and what kind of other things might you guys want to talk about?
Thank you so much for your presentation, Scott. I feel like it was such a great spectrum of experience just from you and your family. I especially liked how you touched on the fixed and open mindset. I feel like that's super important for young adults to just keep an open mind, that just because they aren't where they want to be right now, that doesn't mean that every little crumb of information they accumulate can't get them to where they want to be later. So I also think that it's super good how you showcased how a career path isn't necessarily a straight line, right? It's full of twists and turns, and ultimately your destination is building a community for people who want to make the world better. And I think that if we all follow our passions, that is ultimately where we'll end up, in a community that makes us better. So thank you so much for sharing that.
Well, yeah, and again, the part about the mindset, that is something that I've had the opportunity to work on and be around people that had a very, very open, a very, very excited, infinite mindset. Working with a place like Walt Disney World. I didn't work directly with anybody in the Imagineering group specifically, but I did work alongside people who did work with that group. So I got to learn that um, sometimes it isn't even thinking about outside the box. It's just throwing the box away and saying, what, don't even constrain yourself with that. Um, just I've been able to sit in rooms with people who are like, okay, we need to come up with an idea for this event. And the first part of the meeting was there's no stupid idea. And so, just come up with absolutely anything. And then we can weed out the ones that are impractical later. But, if you like I said, I worked for a guy who flies kites professionally. And, where does something like that come from? Well, that comes from somebody who, hey, the sky is not the limit. That was actually his tagline for a long time. The sky is not the limit. Um, so when you're looking at ideas of what it is that you want to do. Like I said, I'm still working on what I want to be when I grow up. I'm in my 50s. I don't necessarily plan on growing up ever. Is one part of it, but yeah, having that open mindset, having that just always be looking for what is it that I've got as a talent that I can throw at this thing, and and really maybe transform it, or maybe transform me while I'm at it.
Absolutely. And for this portion of the webinar, we are moving into a panel discussion. So we can touch on 5 key strategies for our viewers to keep in mind as they explore career pathways and discover possibilities for themselves. So the 5 key strategies that we will be touching on include learning from your experiences, aligning your values with your choices, defining what success looks like for you, navigating uncertainty, which is something we all struggle with, and building your network, the value of relationships. So, Scott, what was your first job? I know you mentioned to us, but how did you learn?
My first actual job wasn't on that list. My first job was walking soybean fields in early mornings in rural Nebraska, cutting out the weeds.
Wow.
And that was at 14. And if you want to know what I learned from that, it's that to this day is probably the most honest work I've ever done in my life. And what it taught me was um, that no matter what you're doing, you need to be diligent and be intentional about it. We were cutting out weeds so that the harvester could come through and not be torn up by the weeds while it's trying to harvest the soybeans. So it was really important. There was a multi-$100,000 piece of machinery that was at the mercy of what I might leave behind. So it was really important for me to do, and this was when I was doing a job, but it was important for me to do it well, and to understand the reason why. So even if even if your job is putting the fries in the basket and then putting them in the cup and handing them to somebody, understand the reason why it's important for you to do that. And then it becomes a little bit less about what you're doing, and you have that knowledge and you have that perspective, and that's something that again you can use later.
Absolutely. Wow. That's such a wonderful and unique experience just compared to what you ended up going into with music and very creative roles. But I definitely understand how important it is to, even when you're in kind of a less luxurious position with normal for 14-year-olds, you can learn from it, you can grow from it. And ultimately, that is what we want to do. So for Arman, for a younger perspective, what are the biggest concerns you have when thinking about your first job?
Um, okay, well, first of all, Career Scoops is actually my first job, so that's obviously very different compared to how most youth may view it. But especially with my time at Career Scoops and looking at the job market, I think my biggest concern really is to make sure that I'm having valuable use of like my time. Because no matter what I'm doing, I want to make sure that I'm developing some sort of skill that I can then use later on in life. And this could be something from like digital skills, this could be labor, this could just be as simple as talking to other people. And I just want skills that I can transfer to another career that I'm going to later do in life. And I just want to make sure that I'm not working in a too stressful environment, at an early age, and that my time is just used properly.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I feel like you got your idea for career scoops from your experiences, right? From listening to your friends, from seeing the problem and choosing to take action to find a solution. And here you are, you have your own tech company and you're only 16. So even just those small observations of life can really lead you to making a big impact for your future. Um, as far as aligning values, Arman, what do you think are things that are important for you when you think of your future career? Like, is this something that you feel like, I mean, career paths aren't a straight line, right? So right now you're on this path of building this business. So where do you feel like this will take you? Where do you want to see yourself? You know?
So I think the absolute most important thing for me is to be happy where I am through having proper work life balance and financial stability together. Because I want to make sure that the hard work I'm putting into my job is being like reciprocated and rewarded back. But I also want to make sure that I have time to have fun with my hobbies and, family, friends, and financial stability to just make sure that I am confident where I am in life and I am confident in the job that I'm doing. So that is the most important thing for me.
Absolutely. I think that's so important for everybody because I feel like with Career Scoops, we do try to give resources for young adults to align their passions with the options that they have for the future. So, Scott, what were some challenges that you faced in your career, and how did you overcome them, or how did you handle them?
Well, I've had a number of challenges throughout my career, and some of them were um, of my own design, where maybe uh, I allowed myself to get a little bit too caught up in just the day-to-day job that I was doing, and and that can get frustrating. If you're looking at something as I just have these rote activities that I'm doing over and over again, and I do it on Monday, and then I do it on Tuesday, and then I do it on Wednesday, and then and after a while. Really, after a while, anything, including running an exciting startup like Career Scoops, can turn into a little bit of just a job from time to time, and then that can be frustrating. And if you're going for a period of time where you're not really seeing any growth, and you're not actively looking for it, whether in yourself or in your environment, um, you know, that can always be frustrating to anybody. And I've had that, those kind of times. And I've had some times where, all of a sudden the job I was working on, the company I was working with, um, I had one company. I was a operations director for them, and the owner of the company came in one day and said, "All right, we're done. This is your last day of work, and everybody, good luck. We may get you your last paycheck, or we may not. We're not really sure yet because we've kind of lost all of our money." And so I had to deal with not just losing a job, but actually the job just literally disappearing out from underneath me. Um, and so there are challenges that come up, and um I'm going to circle back around to mindset. And it is how you look at it. It's like, okay, am I going to look at this as defining my life? Am I a failure because of this? If I got into an argument with my boss and my boss fires me, um you know uh, do I look back and say, okay, was I trying to justify uh, an opinion, or was I trying to justify my ideals, my values? Was I in a job that went against how I feel about things? Um, so you got to look into that and be a little bit introspective, and and try to decide, okay, um, or if I'm in a job that I love, am I doing this every day and learning from it, or am I just coasting? Am I just enjoying it? And that's okay in some cases, but is that going to be okay 10 years from now? So again, you're kind of looking at what your values are, and the situation that you're in, and um and what can you make of it? So when I lost that job, or when that company disappeared, I suddenly had to go back to my network, go back to the people that I know, and say, okay, I'm looking for something. I'm looking for something interesting, and here's my skill set. Here's what I'm able to do, and and here's what I am able to contribute. And pretty much always I ended up getting a new opportunity that allowed some great growth. So but it's absolutely frustrating when you get, when any challenges come up in front of you.
Absolutely. I mean, I've heard somewhere that rejection can also mean redirection, and
Hmm.
ultimately I feel like it's worked out for you in your career. But you feel like the challenges that you have faced did it help you reevaluate your values? Did it make them kind of grow stronger within you? And, it made you realize what you were working towards, like when you were asking your network, that you're looking for more opportunities?
um, from my perspective now, absolutely. In the moment, not necessarily all the time. I'm like anybody else. You get
Mhm.
frustrated with things, and you can lose your patience, or you can I've suffered from imposter syndrome before, where it's like, if anybody in this room actually knew that I don't know what I'm doing, that I'm just I've gotten into this situation, and now I'm having to work my way out of it. um that's that I have faced that, and I've had to come up and say, okay, but wait a second, I'm in this situation because I have a particular skill set, or I had a particular opportunity, or I was sitting in the right space at the right time, and somebody asked me if I wanted to do something completely outside of my uh you know my my experience. And I just thought, well, yeah, I want
Mhm.
to try that. And
Yeah.
so, as I look back now at the challenges, that some of them seemed insurmountable, and some of them, just absolutely crushed me in the moment. Um, they've defined who I am at this point in my life, and so I'm able to use those things going forward. And if I look back at when I was 19, and I had I had challenges of whatever, like I say, in the moment it was a horrible thing, and absolutely sometimes these things are horrible in the moment, but even 6 months, a year later, I can look and go, but you know what, I learned from that, and I was able to take that and do something else. And maybe it was just a little incremental step. Maybe it was just 1%, not necessarily 1% a day, which a lot of people talk about. Just work on improving 1% a day. That's actually a lot. um, if you can get 1% a week, then you're way above average, and you're still compounding all of that. And so, sometimes you can go, you know what, I didn't make 1% today, but maybe I've made 1 or 2% over the last 2 or 3 weeks. And so I can even look back at, maybe the transition from 19 to 20 to 23 to 25. Yeah, there were challenges, but I was growing that whole
Mhm.
time.
Absolutely. And hindsight is definitely 2020. And as long as we can learn from those challenges and move forward, just like you did, I think there's nothing that can stop us.
Right.
So
And
as far
and
as
and I'll say a 2020 hindsight mindset is also a choice. I could also look. I could look at the the challenges that I went through, and I could harp on those, and I could just concentrate on what the challenges were as opposed to what I learned from it. So 2020 hindsight isn't always is always right. You have a choice of how you look at your own history and
Absolutely.
how you tell your own story.
Yeah, absolutely. That's awesome. So navigating uncertainty. Oh, excuse me. Um, so talking about success. So we're on our third point, defining what success looks like. Arman, how do you define or envision career success?
So, first of all, I think it's important to understand that this is very broad. Like, obviously, success in one career could be like being a CEO, and success in another career could just be like being able to study more what you're interested in. Maybe if you're in like a science field. But for me, I think success is more like what I was stating earlier, being able to be rewarded for the hard work that you're putting in, using the skills you've developed throughout your life and being able to develop them and learn even more skills, as well as also just being surrounded, being like happy with who you are, both in your work life and normal life, and surrounding yourself with good people that you consider to be also successful is what I consider to be career success.
Absolutely. Me and Scott and I were saying earlier, you are the average of who you surround yourself with. So, Scott, I'm curious, what does success look like in your career and how has it changed throughout your experiences?
Well, currently, as I'm working on these new entrepreneurial efforts, for me, success is going to be um, really seriously on how many others I'm helping. And I don't want to come off as too altruistic. I mean, I'm doing this so that I can make money and pay the bills and get my retirement set up and maybe own a house or a jet or a planet myself someday. I'm but the only way that I'm really going to be successful is if I'm helping other people. That's the only way that it's going to come back to me. And I've come to realize that when I look back at when was I the most successful in what I was doing, and B, really the happiest was when I wasn't just doing it for me. And so there's been there's just been opportunities for me to look at my life and say, okay, if it's all about me, then maybe that works in the short term, but it's pretty hollow. So for me, my measure of success is going to be, um, how many people I've been able to lift up.
That's wonderful. Wow, that's really powerful too, because we need more people like you in this world who are, have that balance for compassion for others, and people like Armand who start businesses to help others find their own career path. So I think that's such a beautiful level of success that really can compound in what other success for other people. So that's wonderful. So what advice, Scott, would you give to a young adult who is unsure about their career path, who is navigating uncertainty?
Well, I have direct experience with this with the kids. Currently, the 19-year-old and the 24-year-old who's interested in photography right now. Had had this as well. Um, my advice is whatever situation that you're in, if there's an opportunity that you can take to learn or do something new or 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 help somebody out, that that you can take your experience and your knowledge and your skills and utilize them, maybe in a new way, or maybe for a new cause or a new opportunity. um Take it. Take any opportunity that isn't necessarily going to throw you completely awry of where it is you think you want to go. But if if I hadn't said yes to a couple of the crazy things that came in front of me, I'd be a completely different person now. Maybe better, maybe worse. I don't know. But I wouldn't be the person that I am now if I hadn't, just said, okay, um, I'm going to take this idea over here and I'm going to put it together with this idea over here, and I'm going to see what comes out of it. Um, so, just be open. Again, I'm going to go back to mindset, and I think I'm going to actually skip around to maybe a question that you're going to ask. We had talked about, are there books or podcasts or other resources, and um, Mindset by Carol Dweck. Everyone who is a human should read that book, or at least a synopsis, a summary of it. But Mindset by Carol Dweck. One of my favorite podcasters is James Altucher, who not a whole lot of people have heard of, but he's got a huge podcast, and he's written a number of books. And one of his books is Choose Yourself, a fantastic book. I won't go into too much about who James is, but his attitude and his mindset has had a huge impact on me. Um, I have read a lot of Tony Robbins. Tony Robbins is a bit of a divisive figure. He's a huge personality. But some of the things that he talks about, if you can really kind of look into it, yeah, it really is. Looking at the possibilities and not accepting things just as they are. Um, but I need to put together. I know there's resources online where you can put together a list of podcasts and books and things, and I do need to put together my top 20, which would probably be 200. Um, but yeah, and if I go back, maybe throw one more in there. A classic, uh, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. If you look at that, the first part of it is working on yourself, but then the last part of it, it transitions to how you're working with other people. And so I think there's a great lesson in that is, you do work on yourself and you get your own mindset correct, but then taking that and seeing how do I work with others, and it ends in, how to create situations that are win-win, so that you're not, when people talk about a zero sum game, that means that somebody's winning and somebody's losing. If you're doing it right, you're winning and they're winning, and because the two of you are winning, somebody else is winning. And that's really the way to look at it, is how can you be effective, not just for yourself, but for others as well.
Absolutely. I think that's wonderful because, life throws us a lot of opportunities. And sometimes, I mean, even I get caught up wanting to make the right choice or the wrong choice. And, the reality is you just got to make a choice. You
Yeah.
just got to choose to do your best at whatever you do and to say yes to whatever life throws at you. So thank you so much for that. Now, Arman, what advice would you give to your peers as it relates to thinking about their future career?
Okay, so I think the best advice is to not compare yourself with people that you think, oh, they're successful, it's going to be hard for me to get up to that point. I think you should never do that. The absolute best advice I could give you is compare yourself only to yourself, especially from yourself of yesterday. If every day you can do a little bit of something, and I know you guys brought this up a little bit earlier, if every day you can do a little bit of something to help achieve success for that day, something achievable every single day, in the grand scheme of things, you will achieve that success in any career. This is broad. And so just take those little steps. And I know it's a very popular saying, everyone has heard it, but you'll miss 100% of the shots you don't take. And so it's always important that you take it, because at least then you're one step ahead of everybody that isn't taking that chance.
Ooh, powerful words from a 16-year-old.
Absolutely.
The future's looking bright, y'all. That was great, Arman. I mean, I'll take that advice too. Um, so now our final strategy for exploring career paths is networking and mentorship, how important relationships are. Arman, I would love to know how important is it to talk to a mentor or advisor? How can someone find one?
Okay. So it's so important to me actually to talk to the mentors and advisors that I started Career Scoops about it because um, for me, I loved conversations with those family members and family friends where they're just talking about their own career paths. And these could be career paths that I'm not like interested in myself, but I'm always taking something new from that conversation and bringing it into my own life. Some advice from what they've done to at least be on their journey to being successful to help me on my journey to being successful. And obviously, I proved myself when I spoke to my first mentoring session with a molecular biologist, and I learned not only more stories about like their life and how they got to that point, but also what can I do today that'll help me know whether this career is not only right for me, but so then I can just be better prepared for this career. And obviously, someone using career scoops can help find themselves a mentor at any job that they're interested in. And if they don't know what job that they're interested in, then they can take the free assessment and have an AI tell them what job is best fit for them. And also throughout my Career Scoops journey, I realized that there are a lot of people out there that just simply don't have the resources to be able to connect to those people like mentors and advisors, so that they can know whether this career like really fits them. Not everyone has access to like an engineer or a scientist that they can just talk to at any time and just ask questions. And there's so much information you can learn from these sessions compared to like Google, which is really when I also realized, wow, Career Scoops is really for everybody, and I want everybody to be able to experience this.
Absolutely wonderful. I agree. I think the mission of Career Scoops to really build accessibility and mentorship for everybody is going to be so impactful for so many people. And I can't thank you enough for coming up with the idea. So, Scott, how can a young adult start building their network?
Um, start start building your network. I mean, it's so important. It has been such a huge factor in my career, my life. And you know who is my network? Well, you know what? My neighbors are part of my network because I'm talking to them about what they're doing and finding out things about them, maybe their career or their family or their life, and so that's part of a network. If you're part of a religious group, if you go to church or a synagogue or a mosque, whatever you're involved in, you know, talk to some of the older people there and learn. You can learn more in-depth things about your own faith in doing that, and then you can learn more about them and their lives, and you can see maybe some of the things that they've gone through that you can help to apply. And if you're not, then other places where maybe you just hang out, and you talked about being the average of five people, and you and I had mentioned before we started rolling here. um it's okay to be average, but do pay attention to who you're the average of. So if you're the average of your group, and maybe that group um isn't so good for you, then maybe it's okay to look for another group to hang out with. You don't have to necessarily cut ties with friendships, but if you look back and a year from a year ago and where you're at now, and you haven't progressed, and maybe you spent a lot of time with the same people, it might be time to evaluate that a little bit. Now, as far as building a professional network, there are so many organizations in Orlando and across the U.S. That you could get involved with. Um, Rotary is a it's full of a bunch of old guys, but I tell you what, there's some powerful knowledge in there. The Rotary Club International. There's uh, people may have heard of Toastmasters. If you're not very good at getting up in front of people, it's not as popular as it used to be. But I tell you what, if you can find a Toastmasters group and you get to practice standing up in front of people and talking, if you're an introvert, if you're if that terrifies you, one, know that that makes you human. There you go. We're pretty much all like that. But there are a lot of great organizations where you can practice that on a very small scale, and maybe you're talking in front of two people or three people, and then five people, and then 10 people. Then all of a sudden it makes it easier to do that. I'm part of some great organizations here in Orlando. 1 Million Cups is a fantastic thing for entrepreneurs. Um, you know, uh, but if there's anything that you're interested in, there's a club or a group that meets about it. And so, find it on Meetup or find it, Facebook groups or things like that. There's so many resources out there now, that you can find things that you're interested in and just go hang out with people that are talking about it.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's great advice. And I did want to ask, what is the role of mentorship in career growth, in your opinion?
Um, you're if you're not using a mentor in some capacity for your career growth, then you're doing a lot on your own that you don't necessarily have to. The role of a mentor isn't necessarily to tell you what to do, um, but to listen to what it is that you think you should do, and sometimes just kind of go back and go, all right, think through that a little bit further. Uh, a sales trainer that I had, who was a great mentor for me, would say, okay, let's play that movie all the way through to the end. All right, okay, you've got this idea. Um, that's a great thing right now. What's that going to be like in 2 or 3 years? And a good mentor will prompt you to think better for yourself more than doing the thinking for you, and it allows for you to really work on your own mindset. So being involved with a good mentor, who's going to guide you down that path, not necessarily ride the path for you, I think is very important. So yeah, the role of mentorship, and mentorship has two sides to it. I've got a good friend who says, if you're getting from something, then to balance that out, you have to give. So if you have an opportunity, even if you're 18 or 16 years old, and you can be a mentor to someone else. And I've got mentors that are 20 years my junior, that I'm using. So it doesn't have to be somebody older than you. But part of being able to recognize a good mentor is to maybe practice being a good mentor. So if you've got somebody in your life who needs a little bit of guidance, sit down with them, ask them what it is that they're working on, ask them what it is that they're being challenged with, and see if you can help guide them into some better choices, or some newer choices, or some interesting choices that they weren't thinking of before. And then when you do that yourself, you're going to see, okay, now if I'm looking for a mentor, I'm going to be looking for somebody who can do that sort of thing for me.
Mhm. Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's such great advice because um, often we think that we're not enough, or we don't have enough experience, we don't have enough knowledge to really offer advice. But if we really look around, like all experience is valuable experience, especially if you learn from it. So I think that's a great takeaway from for mentorship, and just getting used to it, adapting it, and adopting it into your life. So final thoughts from either of you as we close out this wonderful webinar.
Well, I greatly appreciate the opportunity to talk with you guys, and hopefully this has We've been able to pass on some information. Absolutely, I encourage anybody watching this to reach out to somebody that you trust, and just throw your ideas past them. Even the craziest, silliest, stupidest idea. Um, you know, 98% of them aren't ever going to work. Um, but this is the 2% that that can change your life. And if you think, how many decisions or how many things you come across in a day, if you could take 2% of those and just, maybe do something a little bit more with them, and like Arman was saying, a little bit every day, just trying to say, okay, what can I take here from this pile that I have? And maybe at times it's a steaming pile, but what can I do? What can I do with it that I'm just going to improve a little bit? And maybe it isn't improving you. Maybe it's taking the opportunity to improve somebody else. And I, if I can leave with some thoughts, if you're approaching anything that you've got, uh, not necessarily so much what's in it for me, but what might be in it for somebody else. There's another great book, What's in It for Them. That's another one to look up. But seeing where you can serve somebody else, I think is always a great opportunity for you to grow yourself.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that, Scott. Any closing thoughts, Armand?
Yep. First of all, I really learned a lot today. Thank you so much, Scott, for just sharing your life and all the experiences you went through. And I just also want to ask, would you say that from every skill that you like, for every part of your career journey that you went through, would you say you adopted at least one thing from all of these and then like culminated all together into who you are now?
Oh, absolutely. I showed earlier the name of my company here. I'll bring this up again. I've had this technology. Um, the history of that actually goes back. That's the license plate on my car and has been for over 20 years.
Wow.
Um, and I realized, one day when I decided to kind of make that my company name as well. The definition of the word technology, if you were to spell it the way the rest of the world spells it, is the practical application of knowledge. And I've really kind of adopted that. Yes, every experience that I've gone through has shaped part of who I am. And the good things, the bad things have all helped in determining how I make decisions. And I don't always make the right decisions, even now. I can make three bad decisions before breakfast, but um, but I have been able to look back and go, okay, what did I learn uh, 20 years ago that maybe I ought to be applying today?
All right,
Wonderful.
that's good for me to know. Like, and obviously, right now, I'm still young. I'm still building this experience and skills and knowledge. And as I said, I just want to make sure I'm spending my time on the correct things and taking a bit of knowledge from everything that I'm doing every day. So
Oh
it's
yeah,
good to
but the
know.
but the bad choices and the mistakes and the bad decisions that you're going to make, oh, they're going to be epic. you know and as long as you don't set the woods on fire, which I've set the woods on fire. um you know as long as you're not just torching the world with it, if you're paying attention to what you're doing, and you go through and you make a mistake and you go, okay, wait a second, what can I learn from this? There's somebody that said, there, you either win or you learn. There is no. So, but that's a mindset thing. So, as if you're thinking that I'm going to grow from everything that is good, and well, that's not really how life works. You're going to make a lot of mistakes, and um, boy, if you can make some doozies, make some big ones. That's fun.
Absolutely. You either win or you learn. I think that's a great way to conclude this wonderful webinar. I'll do a quick summary. as we are exploring career pathways and discovering possibilities for our viewers, we have touched on 5 strategies to think about and consider when making those choices. We have talked about learning from all of our experiences. We have learned to align our values, define what success looks like so we know where we're headed. We have touched on navigating uncertainty and the value of relationships, building your network. We have also got exposed to Scott Hill's wonderful experience and how his career path has shaped him, and his thoughts have really helped us move forward in discovering the possibilities that are unlimited as long as you have the right mindset and win and learn. So thank you guys so much.
Well, thank you so much. This has really been an honor.
Yeah, and today was just a great conversation.